It's often said that justice isn't always fair. And to be honest, there have been many cases throughout history that have proved just that. From shocking legal blunders to heartbreaking tales of innocent lives disrupted, we are here to shed light on cases where the truth was elusive. So get ready as we dive into the top 10 wrongful convictions. Thomas Kennedy. We start off with the story of Thomas Kennedy, a 31-year-old father of two who faced one of the most difficult moments of his life when he was accused by his 11-year-old daughter, Cassandra, of having raped her on multiple occasions back in 2001. Kennedy was accused of 3 counts of rape and faced trial in July 2002. The poor man's daughter managed to convince the jury about her allegations and got her father to be sentenced to 15 years in prison. It wasn't until 2012 that Cassandra went to the police and confessed to having lied about the whole situation and explained what really had happened. You see, Cassandra was a very troubled kid who by the age of 11 was already engaging in sexual activity. It wasn't hard to think her father had in fact abused her after it was discovered she wasn't a virgin anymore. However, Cassandra confessed she had started having sex with the boy in his class who many years later confirmed the now young girl's testimony. When Cassandra was asked about why she did such a thing, she claimed to have wanted her father to go away because he started drinking and smoking marijuana. Later that year, Kennedy was absolved of all charges, and 2 years later he got over $500,000 from the state in compensation for the time he served in prison. Nora Wall. Nora Wall became part of history for being the first woman convicted of child abuse in Ireland. Much like the previous case, she was also a victim of false testimony which led to her life almost being ruined. You see, it was 1999 when she was accused of having participated in the rape of a 10-year-old Patricia Whalen. Nora's accuser was a man named Pablo McCabe, who also confessed to having abused the little girl. It didn't take long for the court to send both to trial and determined they were guilty of all charges. The girl's testimony also helped to get a conviction, and that caused Wall to be sentenced to spend life in prison. Fortunately, just a few days later, the alleged victim came clear and confessed she had lied during her testimony, and both Wall and McCabe were released only 4 days after they were sent to jail. McCabe was found to suffer from schizophrenia and would later retract his confession. Even though Nora Wall didn't spend more than 4 days in prison, she went through a lot of media harassment and sought compensation for the emotional stress she went through. 8 years later, justice was finally served, and she obtained £390,000 in compensation. Central Park 5. Time goes by and racism continues to be a thing. We've seen multiple cases worldwide where people are victims of injustice just for the color of their skin. One of those cases, and perhaps one of the most infamous, is that of the Central Park 5, a group of 5 Black and Latino teenagers who were unjustly accused and convicted of brutally assaulting and raping a white female jogger in New York City's Central Park. The events, which took place in 1989, caused public outrage and people fueled a rush to judgment. Police at the time wanted nothing else but to close the case quickly, so they put pressure on the 5 suspects, all of them under 16 years old, to take the blame for a crime they hadn't committed. All 5 suspects were sentenced to spend several years in prison, going from 7 to 13 years. But things would take an unexpected turn when more than 10 years after the attack, serial rapist Matias Reyes confessed to actually being the sole responsible for the jogger's rape back in 1989. He went on to confess to other 5 rapes during that same year, and DNA evidence confirmed his involvement. And the 5 wrongfully accused teenagers were released from prison. They would then go on to sue the city of New York for malicious prosecution and racial discrimination and settled for $41 million. The West Memphis 3. The West Memphis 3 is the name used to refer to the trio of teenagers that were accused of the brutal murder of 3 friends aged 8 back in 1993 in a small town in the state of Arkansas. It all started when 3 young kids went out for a bike ride and never came back. Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers. 3 innocent victims that found dead when they weren't looking. The stepfather to one of the children reported his son missing, and after 1 day of searching, police found the bodies dumped in a ditch, and all of them with signs of torture. 2 of the kids had died from drowning, and one of them bled out as he was castrated. The case quickly made the news, and people were furious. They demanded the responsible be apprehended as soon as possible, And much like in the previous case, police took the easy way out and pinned it all to the outcast of the town, Daniel Eccles, a metalhead who was not much appreciated by people during that time due to fear of Satanism. He and two of his friends were apprehended, falsely accused, and convicted for the crime that shocked the town. Eccles was sentenced to death and his friends to life imprisonment. It wasn't until 2011 that they were released upon re-examining the case and discovering neither of the alleged offenders had been near the crime during that day. The real killer was never caught, and the Memphis Three spent nearly 20 years behind bars for a crime they didn't commit. Julie Ray. October 1997. A single mother living with her son woke up in the middle of the night after hearing a scream. She immediately went to her son's bedroom to see if he was okay, but found herself in the middle of a horror scene. Her 10-year-old son had been stabbed to death. Police got involved and Ray claimed an intruder had broken into the house, and they both struggled before the man fled. The police searched for the man, but he could never be found. So 3 years later, after a flawed investigation, Ray was charged with killing her own son after prosecutors used a forensic discipline called blood-stain pattern analysis, which supposedly proved that there was no intruder the night of the incident and that it had been Ray who had killed their son. She was convicted of first-degree murder in 2002, but got released 4 years later after a retrial where it was proven the evidence against her was not solid. It would eventually be discovered Ray's son had been killed by a serial killer of children who got caught and sent to death row. Ryan Ferguson. Ryan Ferguson is yet another man who was falsely accused of a crime he didn't commit. He had been implicated in the death of sports editor named Kent Heithold, who was found beaten and strangled in the parking lot of the Columbia Daily Tribune. 2 years had gone by without finding a suspect when a man named Charles Erickson called the police to confess about the crime and implicated Ferguson in the process. An employee for the Daily Tribune would serve as a witness, and his testimony, along with that of Erickson, cost Ferguson to serve almost a decade in prison before being released in 2013. Both witnesses recanted their testimony and admitted to having been coerced to lie by the then prosecuting attorney Kevin Crane. Ferguson won an $11 million civil suit against the Missouri police and continued with his life, even getting to appear in season 33 of the reality show The Amazing Race. Ricky Jackson. Ricky Jackson, Ronnie Bridgman, and Wiley Bridgman are the names of the 3 African-American men who were wrongfully convicted for the murder of a businessman in 1975. The victim was robbed and killed in broad daylight when one of the robbers threw acid at his face while the other shot him twice. They fled the scene in a green car, and police built a case against Jackson based on the testimony of a 12-year-old boy who lied about being a witness to the homicide. Jackson used to live in the neighborhood, and it was easy to pin it all on him. So when police decided he was responsible for the crime, there was nothing he could do to convince them otherwise. 2 more men got arrested for the homicide, but they both made it out years later on parole. For Jackson, however, things wouldn't be as easy, since he was denied parole for allegedly being the one who shot the victim, and ended up spending 39 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. It wasn't until 2014 that the then 12-year-old came clean and admitted he had been coerced by the police to accuse Jackson of the killing. Ricky was set free and compensated with almost $1 million. Timothy Evans. Timothy Evans was a man who, much like everybody else in this list, was wrongfully accused for a crime he did not commit. Evans had suffered the loss of his wife and 11-month-old daughter to the hands of a serial killer named John Christie, who was also his downstairs neighbor. Christie had been responsible for the death of several more people in the same building, including his own wife, Ethel. Police didn't know that yet, and so they convicted Evans in 1950 to be hanged for the murder of his wife and daughter. Unlike the previous cases in this list, Evans did not make it out, and he did actually die due to the wrong conviction. When Christie was discovered to be the actual killer, he was sentenced to death, and this case played a major part in the removal of capital punishment in the UK in 1965. Stephen Avery. Stephen Avery was convicted for the sexual assault of a woman jogging along Lake Michigan and convicted to serve 32 years in prison. He was released after 18 months when a new DNA test proved he wasn't the man responsible for the crime perpetrated in 1985. What's interesting about this case is how Avery went back to prison only 2 years after being released for a different crime. This time, he was sentenced to spend life in prison along with his nephew Brendan Dassey for supposedly being the authors in the death of 25-year-old photographer Terracin Hallback. At the time of the murder, Avery was negotiating a settlement of $36 million for the time he spent in prison. But with this new accusation against him and his nephew, that would all go away. His supporters believe he was framed so the Manitowoc County wouldn't have to pay for their mistake in Avery's first conviction. But nothing has been proven yet. The story of Stephen Avery became so popular that it was even featured on Netflix's hit, Making a Murderer. Reuben Hurricane Carter. Reuben Hurricane Carter was a renowned American middleweight boxer whose life took a dramatic turn due to a wrongful murder conviction. In 1966, he and another man were accused of a triple murder in New Jersey and got 3 life sentences that changed their lives forever. He was accused of being part of the crime because his car had gone by the road near where the murder had been committed twice during the night. It wasn't until 1985 that he was set free, and his story inspired songs and movies alike. And that's all for today. If there's something to learn here, is that justice isn't always fair. Which of these cases did you find the saddest of all? Let us know in the comments below. And as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. See you next time.